I did have one brief moment when it seemed like everything elevated to something that got a lot more important and a lot more time sensitive. And I thought that is the only part where I thought, am I going to die?
Alrighty, guys. So that was a clip you've just watched featuring Tim Don on a podcast he did some time ago now, talking about this heart attack which he experienced a couple of years ago during an actual long-distance triathlon event itself, and a very scary thing to have happened to him, and definitely something which, of course, should draw a lot of emotion, as you can see there on his face, and also be a strong cause for reflection and consideration as to why you're doing the sport and where you're going to go moving forward. Do you continue on? And really just an overall assessment of your life, your health, and everything else in general. We know, however, that Tim did continue on in the sport of triathlon, in the sport of Ironman. He raced Kona and had a great performance there this year in October of 2022. So things obviously moving in the right direction for Tim now. However, a massive scare, wake-up call, maybe you could say even, although you consider that, he's probably doing most things right. But one thing to keep in mind is that you can be a professional athlete, you can be an age group athlete, and just because you're super fit and just because you exercise a lot doesn't mean you don't have risk factors for heart disease or myocardial infarction, otherwise known as heart attack, or any other cardiovascular related conditions. So why is this so important to consider? Well, I think that the general conception or idea is that, if you do exercise a lot, well, you're very protected against this stuff. Not the case at all. Whilst exercise and physical activity indeed is a strong protective factor against heart attack and heart disease, excessive exercise or too much stress on the heart, which is just another form of stress. We can have psychological, emotional, physical, all these kinds of stresses. It's another form of stress which can impact the heart itself. But in this video, we're going to talk about heart attack risk factors and how you can really mitigate your individual risk for suffering a heart attack in the future, and just improving your health of your heart in general, and some of the things you really want to look at, and some of the modifiable and non-modifiable things that may be applicable to you. Now, obviously note that none of this is medical advice, just a general list of things that you can kind of have in the back of your mind as to, do you want to get them checked up on? Do you want to kind of improve this health parameter, this health marker or indicator, and look at some of these things that you can actually do to improve your heart health. So, number one on this list, high blood pressure. High blood pressure can exert significant stress on the arteries, blood vessels, particularly the blood vessels that actually supply the heart itself. So if you're affecting them, then you affect the capacity of those blood vessels to deliver blood to the heart muscle. And therefore, you can, I guess, as a consequence, limit the amount of oxygen, blood and oxygen reaching the heart itself, and suffer a infarction or ischemia in the first instance, and then infarction if you have a complete blockage. So high blood pressure, nothing to be brushed off as inconsequential or insignificant, and one thing you really want to manage. Obviously, try, depending on where your baseline levels of blood pressure are, if they're normal, fantastic, or healthy, fantastic. If they're mildly elevated, work with your doctor. Usually the general approach will be diet and exercise, reducing stress, looking at lifestyle first. If that doesn't work, medication. And whilst I'd say most people don't want to be dependent on a medication for something like blood pressure, or even going down the list, cholesterol and triglycerides, and all this kind of stuff. At the end of the day, you don't want to have high blood pressure. And one of the most influential medical advances has been the advent or development of blood pressure medications, which have been proven and shown to significantly extend life in absence of any other factor, lifestyle change, regardless. Reducing blood pressure into the optimal healthy range is very important. And if you need to get there with medication, then it's nothing to be looked down upon or to be, I guess, afraid of, because the alternative is a lot worse. So high blood pressure, get that in check. High cholesterol and or triglycerides. So high blood triglycerides, these are floating around in the blood. Triglycerides are just, a form of fat that is floating in the blood. We have high cholesterol as well. So when we look at high cholesterol, I guess the main thing is looking at LDL, and you want to ensure that your LDL, which is your low density lipoprotein, sometimes referred to as like the bad cholesterol. It's a little bit too simplistic, but in general terms, it works. So LDL needs to be on the lower end, and HDL, which in simple terms, again, I know it's more complicated than this, but HDL is like the good cholesterol, should be on the higher end. And then your overall total cholesterol shouldn't necessarily be too high either. But I guess mainly looking at total cholesterol, but then the ratio as well is very important. So ensuring that your LDL or your low density lipoprotein markers or indicators aren't overly elevated is very important. And then reducing blood triglycerides. So again, diet, lifestyle, obviously address this first, and then medication if needed. Nothing to be, I guess, resistant to if you can't change this with diet, etc. The next thing is obesity. So again, this probably doesn't relate to a lot of endurance athletes, but carrying excess body weight, of course, increases the risk of many metabolic conditions, particularly high blood pressure, particularly high cholesterol or triglycerides and diabetes, and generally, increasing the atherosclerotic or sclerotic plaque, which is basically the cholesterol deposits which can lodge in the blood vessels themselves and cause narrowing of those blood vessels, and therefore increase the likelihood of a heart attack because you're restricting the amount of blood that can get through them. You're also increasing the likelihood of a blood clot, for example. The next thing is diabetes. Again, high blood sugar, but particularly chronically elevated insulin levels has negative consequences to the blood vessels themselves and the heart health. So address diabetes. Obviously, if you're type 1 diabetic, you can't do much about it, but just try and get that as best in order as you can. And then with type 2 diabetes, which is our insulin resistant type diabetes, looking at diet, lifestyle first, and then medications if that all else fails. Metabolic syndrome. So this is a combination of a few things. Generally, you require 3 of the following list, which I believe it's like hypertension, adipose fat or fatty tissue around the actual abdomen and belly area. It can include diabetes as well, and then elevated cholesterol, triglycerides. So it's a combination of many of these things, which is characterized as metabolic syndrome. And then a family history of heart attacks. Now, this is something you can't control, but I think it's important to be aware of family history because you can be a little bit, everyone should be vigilant of their health and improving their health. But with a family history, I guess it really puts more emphasis on the fact that, hey, look, there's a strong genetic component to most health conditions. I'd say pretty much any or all health conditions. And while diet, lifestyle, individual risk factors that you can control play a large part, family history and genetics play a really big part too. So it's something you can't control, but be aware if you do have a family history. Make sure you're always, regardless of family history, but particularly if you're putting it off, whatever, and you do have a family history, make sure you're getting those health screens. Make sure you're having your blood pressure taken, getting these blood tests for cholesterol, triglycerides, etc. The next thing is an unhealthy diet, which I think a lot of athletes can kind of suffer from because it's almost like the training is particularly Ironman, triathlon, long distance, if you're cycling or running, the training itself burns through so many calories. So it can almost be an excuse to like go and eat a lot of high fat meals, etc. Regarding diet, what the research has really looked at is a more Mediterranean style diet. So you guys can go and have a look at that itself, which is a bit lower on the saturated and trans fats, a little bit higher on the monounsaturated or polyunsaturated fats. But essentially, a Mediterranean diet, I guess, in the research is found to be more of a protective factor against heart attack than I guess, a standard American diet. Also looking at things like increasing your consumption of fiber, plant, whole-based foods. Generally, when you're going whole foods in terms of reducing processed foods and all that kind of stuff, and fast foods, you're going to be pretty good. So addressing diet, and don't discount the impact of diet, even if you are exercising a lot, because just being lean and looking fit doesn't mean that the arteries, the blood vessels, the blood itself is functioning or operating at 100% capacity. The next thing is stress. And if we look at our age group athletes, stress is a huge, I'm going to say problem, because it really is a problem, because it's one thing to go and train, and that is a physical stress which actually damages the body, but it's the reparative processes that occur through that and actually having that stress on the body that lead to you becoming stronger and more healthier. However, if you're overdoing it, well, that's a problem. So that's a physical stress problem. Also mental stress and psychological stress. So financial, whether it's in the workplace, whether it's in the family, relationships, different life circumstances. Everyone's going to be going through different things. But nonetheless, that kind of mental stress or cognitive stress as well can definitely compound with the physical stress and place an increased stress on the heart. So, addressing that and trying to, I guess, have stress mitigation techniques, whatever it is that calms you down, and then also, getting your blood tests. And if you do notice that you have chronically elevated cortisol, and like I did in the previous video, and reduced levels of the anabolic hormones or your reparative hormones, so testosterone growth hormone, if your thyroid's a bit messed up, but your cortisol, prolactin are kind of like always a bit too high, probably under some chronic stress, and you really want to look at ways in which you can reduce that. The next one, illegal drug use. So probably not that common with athletes, particularly age group athletes. But that said, I think that, it is one thing to be aware of, that recreational drug use is, I guess, probably more common than people realize. For those who don't partake in it, I guess like the rates are higher than people would maybe assume. So stimulant medications, or not medications, but drugs, particularly like cocaine or amphetamines, can really increase the demand on the heart, increase the heart rate, the blood pressure, and all of these factors can lead to, of course, in the worst case situation, a heart attack. So if it's a problem that you're dealing with and you're also doing a lot of training, but you have this issue with recreational drug use, particularly stimulant use, then that can be a problem. Now, an autoimmune condition, so things like lupus, things like rheumatoid arthritis. Why is autoimmune conditions a risk factor? Well, it's generalized inflammation in the body. And when you have generalized inflammation in the body because of, for example, one, an autoimmune condition, but also other factors like past viral infection, these things can lead to inflammation, and they can lead to inflammation of the heart, which can even result in things like pericarditis, which is inflammation of the sac surrounding the heart, or myocarditis, which is inflammation of the actual heart muscle itself. And all these can be caused by many, many factors. There's genetic factors, there's external factors like viral infection, autoimmune, and then internal factors like autoimmune conditions, etc. There's things we can't even talk about on YouTube itself currently, but really just being aware of the impact of inflammation generally in your body and focusing on how you can reduce that. So one of the most important things I think with autoimmune conditions is having optimal, or at least not preventing them because there's genetics, but like in the general prevention very broadly and treatment of them, and improving the health of the immune system, making sure your vitamin D is on check, and then doing all the right things. So reducing stress and all that kind of stuff. So all of these really tie into each other, as you can kind of see. Age is a non-modifiable thing. You can't control it. But generally, if you're a male over 40 to 45 years old, or a female over 50 to 55 years old, you therefore have a high risk of heart attack or myocardial infarction nonetheless. And you can't do anything about that. It's an unfortunate reality of getting older, but you can be aware of it. And it's much like the family history side of things, or the genetic side of things, just having it in the back of your mind and being cognitively, kind of aware that, okay, look, I am at that age where it's going to be, I'm at an age where I have an increased risk, and therefore, look, I really need to have this mindset of health rather than just performance and going out at every single, at the very cost of sacrificing your health for performance, because we know that, just being fit in and of itself isn't an indicator of overall balanced well-being and health. And then tobacco use. So again, kind of like another stimulant, but tobacco, particularly smoking, nicotine itself, that can increase cortisol and have effects on the blood vessels, but it's kind of in the same category as like caffeine. If you're only supplementing with those things and not overdoing it, genetics play a part again. Is it necessarily going to be a huge risk? Maybe not, but it's very individual dependent. So you need to really monitor that on an individual basis and never overdo any stimulant use, even if it is just coffee, caffeine, etc. But tobacco use and smoking, particularly smoking, and all the chemicals that are associated with that, that can have really adverse consequences on the blood vessels, on the heart health, on the blood, thickening the blood up itself. So definitely something you want to address if you are doing a lot of exercise and putting stress on your body, and then compounding that with something that's also putting stress on the blood vessels, on the heart. Maybe, look into ways in which you could potentially quit smoking or tobacco use if that's a problem as well. So there's a list. I think that's about 12 different things. There are more risk factors than this for myocardial infarction, or otherwise known as heart attack. However, I think at the end of the day, all it comes down to really is just trying to be the most balanced, healthy version of yourself, getting regular blood checks, making sure your blood pressure, your cholesterol, your triglycerides are in check, your weight's in check, your blood sugars and insulin levels are in check, and then doing the right thing. So it is kind of intuitive and common sense, but I think that the most important thing to take away from this, and the most important lesson that we can learn from Tim O'Donnell suffering a heart attack as such a high performance, fit individual, is that, heart attacks don't discriminate. And whilst your physical health can, or your physical fitness can, in essence, I guess, mitigate some of the risk factors or reduce your risk factors in general, this is something which can affect anyone or everyone, and you don't ever want to take your heart health lightly, and just be aware of your risk factors if they apply to you, and trying to mitigate them as best as possible, and doing all the things which protect you. So just because you're fit doesn't mean you're immune to all of these conditions which affect the general population. So hopefully that was not too boring of a talk, interesting for some of you guys. Take care. Leave any questions below, post them in the comments, and I will see you everyone in the next video. Cheers.